Hey everyone, Matt with EDH Rec here, and I'm on this video today to take you through all of my commander decks and where they fall into the new commander bracket system. We've had a lot of new feedback coming through with this new bracket system that Wizards of the Coast recently announced, and so we want to take you through and give you a chance to see where my decks fall into this new system and the thought process that goes behind them. If you're not too familiar with the new commander bracket system, we already have tons of videos going through into great detail what this new commander bracket system looks like and the thoughts that went into it. You may have actually already seen Joey's video ranking all of his decks, but now it's my turn to see where my decks fall on the new commander bracket system. So to recap the brackets real quick, there's bracket 1, which is exhibition, which is more focused on theme than winning. There's bracket 2, or core, which is comparable to modern precons. Bracket 3 is upgraded with more thoughtful card choices and synergies leading up to 3 game changer cards as well. Then there's bracket 4, which is optimized, where you're playing no holds barred, unlimited game changers, and everything is on the table. And then finally there's bracket 5, which is the CEDH, where you are actively trying to take down an entire tournament metagame by yourself. And if any of you would like to see the deck list that I'm talking about in this video today, they're going to be in the description below, so make sure you check those out over on Architect. Feel free to give them a look and let me know if you agree with where my rankings are and how I'm classifying them in my own head. And while you're there, consider dropping a like and subscribe on this video while you're at it. And with that, let's get into the rankings here. So what we're going to do, we are going to start off with probably the longest deck, the decks that I'm the most well known for. And as Mr. Selesnya on the show myself, we have to start off with Emiel. This is my Emiel the Blessed deck. I love this. I've had this in some form or fashion for a long time. I've had a Selesnya deck pretty much since I started playing Commander. I like to call this my It's Not a Snack, It's Emiel, because Emiel the Blessed, definitely a lot to handle. So right off the bat, this deck, it really does tinker on being between that bracket 3 and bracket 4. There's only 3 game changers in there right now, but I also think the game changers honestly might be a little overrated by the community right now. It's such a new thing, so it's very easy for players to latch onto the idea of game changers and see maybe these are too powerful or not, but a lot of them are definitely powerful. There's Rhystic Study, Cyclonic Rift, a lot of big offenders when it comes to kind of ruining games in some sense, but when it comes to green and whites, there aren't that many. So thankfully, I don't have to battle with having too many game changers in this Selesnya deck. With that said, though, I really think I intended this deck to be a bracket 3. It's better than a precon, but it's not super high powered. It can definitely hang. If I have a very good draw, I can hang with any deck at the pod, whether I'm playing with bracket 4, whether I'm playing with some more powerful precons. I don't know if I would really play this against precons, which is kind of why this is on the cusp here. But if we're playing to the letter of the law, I haven't really built it with fully optimized card choices yet, so I really struggle to say that it's bracket 4, but I also would feel kind of weird if I played it against a lot of modern precons too, because in the Commander announcement, they talked a lot about how you can play up or down a level. I don't know if I would play down a level with my Emiel deck, and maybe it should be classified as bracket 4, but for now, just because I haven't fully optimized it yet, it's well on its way, but there are definitely some suboptimal cards that I just play because I really want to play them. Cards like Angel of Indemnity that you get to reanimate a whole bunch of things, and this is my Panharmonicon deck, so I'm just doubling all the ETB triggers. All the creatures have some sort of ETB ability or a way to multiply that, so it's definitely a little bit themed still in lieu of optimized card choices, so I'm going to stick it in the upgraded bracket 3 right there. Next up is my newest deck. So this is Jetmir, the Nexus of Revels. This is my Heir Apparent deck, and this deck came out very hard. I love it so much because it does go fast. I joke that, oh, well, all I'm doing is casting a whole bunch of 2-drops because Heir Apparent comes down and it makes a whole bunch of rabbit tokens. But really, those rabbit tokens aren't ever just 1/1s, or if there are, there's just so many of them, it's so hard to keep up with. I first built this deck and I had 0 game changers in there because all the game changers were just too expensive to be playing. I could have looked at a Jeska's Will that would have fit in all right, but I didn't like it at first because it only made red mana, and I'm casting a lot of white mana pips in this deck. And so I really didn't love the idea of too many game changers, and I built this right before the new Commander bracket came out. So I wanted to be powerful, but it wasn't going to be a bracket 4. As I've been playing it though, it is very hard to say that it's not a bracket 4. It's an optimized deck at this point. It's so fast, it's so powerful. I definitely would never play this against a bracket 2. It hangs with a whole lot of powerful decks. I've played it at MagicCon Chicago, and I think I won 2 out of 3 games I played with it, and I was playing against other very, very powerful decks. And even before we even had the bracket system, my first run with this deck, I said, this deck is trying to do powerful things. I don't know if it's there yet, because I just haven't gotten a chance to play it. I definitely won games, and there's powerful synergies in this deck. There's stuff like Allurin that just makes everything pop off and go super, super powerful, casting all of my Heir Apparents for free. The only real area of struggle is maybe that early card draw, because I am in Naya colors. But if I do get a little bit of an engine going on, even one engine piece like a Beast Whisperer, this deck will take off. So it's definitely powerful. I do think in good faith, I have to classify this as a bracket 4 deck. I can't say it's bracket 3 because the goal is to win with this deck. I built this deck with the intention to win. And I think that's one thing that is maybe getting missed a little bit in the whole bracket power conversation, is the intent behind the deck. Are you trying to win games, or are you trying to express something? Are you trying to explore the space? And really the intent behind this deck was to win. So I can't say it's bracket 3. It does have the game changers in there, but it's trying to win, and it's trying to do it quickly. So bracket 4 is definitely where I would put this. The next deck though is my Council of 4 deck. So this deck was meant to be a scalable deck. One article years and years ago that our content manager over at EDH Rec, Jason Alt, he wrote an article with the 75% theory, which was the deck isn't optimized, but it's also built to play up or down to whatever the rest of the table is doing. There's a lot of cards that are stealing people's cards, for example, with the mindset of they're not going to put cards that are too powerful for them to handle themselves. And so by that, thought process, Council of 4 was kind of the perfect deck where the more my opponents are doing, the more I get to do, but the less they're doing, the less I get to do, because of cards that scale with how well the opponent's doing. In Council of 4, just because of the abilities on the card, when my opponent does something, does a second card that they draw every turn, I get to draw a card. Well, if they're not drawing a bunch of cards on their turns, then really I'm not doing much either. In the same vein that more opponents are casting spells on their turn, then I'm getting my knights there. So really, it's a perfect deck to kind of go up or down. This deck is definitely core. I had a game changer in there, but this was a chance for me to kind of reevaluate and say, do I want this to be a bracket 3 and really kind of try to hang with those bracket 4 decks? But it doesn't do that very well. It is a little bit of a slow deck just because it is Azorius. It is a control deck for sure. And so really, I just took this as an opportunity to take the one game changer out of there and then call it a bracket 2 deck. So I can play with so many different people at the table. I really love this deck. It's been a lot of fun to play. And I am really torn because sometimes I do want to keep stuff into the bracket 3, but really having one deck that kind of can play up or down, I might put the Smothering Tithe back in. I'm not really sure. But for now, it is bracket 2 as of when I went to MagicCon Chicago and got a chance to explore this a little bit. So next up is my Omnath Locus of Rage deck. This is the deck I have had in existence for the longest. This was one of my very first commander decks, actually, and it's evolved over time into being a very, very powerful deck. I want to say I'm more familiar with this commander deck than maybe any other deck that I've played, even dating back to when I was playing 60 card formats and I was on that tournament grind. It is really hard to make upgrades in this deck, which is actually a reason that I haven't made an update in this deck, just changing out a single card in quite a while. It's so hard to make changes to landfall decks these days, just because the quality of whatever you could be considering for a landfall deck is so tight. It's really, really hard to build I would argue a bracket 2 deck even if you're playing in the landfall strategies, because the cards are so powerful. Lands have never been more powerful. I know that a topic of debate is Primeval Titan. Does it get unbanned in this commander bracket game changer type of era that we're in for commander? And landfall decks definitely are an argument why Primeval Titan should stay banned. I would love to play it myself, but I also know that may not be the best thing to happen for the format. So it's very, very interesting to see what is going to happen with a lot of these banned cards and if they come off, because I definitely will add Primeval Titan into this with my mana base, with all these utility lands that I'm playing. There's a whole lot going on there. I'm not even playing any game changers in there. That's how tight this deck is. I actually think red and green got off very, very easily when it comes to how many game changers are in those colors. If you've listened to any of our content, any of our videos talking about the bracket system, talking about the game changers that are out there, there aren't very many, and there's definitely some contenders. That said, this deck does not take any prisoners. This deck is all about going super, super hard. If I'm making the totally optimized card choices when it comes to this deck, it's so hard to put this in anything but tier for that bracket for optimized. The card choices, the intent behind this is definitely to be doing the best possible thing, and that just flat out means this is a bracket 4 deck. Completely opposite side of the spectrum, I would say, from my Omnath Locus of Rage is my Sam Loyal Attendant and Frodo deck. So this is the partners. This came as the pre-constructed deck from Lord of the Rings, and I love this deck so much because I'm just a huge Lord of the Rings fan. I've always enjoyed that series. I read the books when I was growing up, and so when I heard that there was going to be a Universes Beyond complete set for Lord of the Rings, I was so excited, so ready to put Magic the Gathering cards together with Lord of the Rings. So I immediately built and knew I was going to have this pre-constructed deck, and I bought all 4 precons. I've changed a couple of them and left the other 2 just out of the box because I want to enjoy that experience. I still play them every now and then just to enjoy what they built. And so Lord of the Rings is just very near and dear to my heart. But the one that I've committed to personalizing the most definitely was my Sam and Frodo deck. So this deck is all about the character of Sam Loyal Attendant and Samwise Gamgee in the books. And absolutely, this deck is not playing optimal card choices at all. I'm playing like field-tested frying pan. I haven't gotten a chance to yet, but there are so many cards that are just not optimal, but they describe the character of Samwise Gamgee, and that's why this definitely is kind of the prototypical exhibition bracket 1 deck where I'm not trying to win, I'm trying to express something. I'm trying to put out what Samwise Gamgee was like in the books and in the movies and put them into Magic the Gathering. And this definitely came out as bracket 1. It always was meant to be bracket 1. I very rarely change cards in this deck for kind of the opposite reason that I never change cards in my Omnath Locus of Rage deck, because there aren't ever going to be very many cards that are going to kind of mimic that personality and that character that I'm trying to display in this deck. There is a card from the upcoming Final Fantasy set with the side quest for fishing. I'm very excited to put in there, but I maybe will change 1 card a year just because of, again, how tight this is. But also, it's just so much fun to have a deck that also is finished for me. I don't have to worry about updating this and keeping it in the back of my mind, because very rarely am I going to get more cards, either with flavor text or what the card does, that express what Sam Gamgee is. So I love this deck so much, but it is definitely a bracket 1 deck. In the same vein, I have a Tom Bombadil deck, and this is definitely a bracket 2 deck. I'm trying to express something because it's all sagas, but it doesn't really explode. It doesn't try to win games. It does powerful things for sure, but I'm not actively trying to win a whole bunch of games with this. I'm trying to play a bunch of sagas and kind of just go through with emotions a little bit. I need to reevaluate this deck because it's been a long time since I've gotten to play it. I think, again, with the upcoming Final Fantasy set, having sagas again, it will give me a chance to kind of reevaluate the card choices in there and give some new life into this deck. We don't get sagas very often, and I think that might be, for me, why Tom Bombadil, I was very excited to build this deck originally, but it kind of stagnated a little bit. So we'll see if some of these upcoming sets with sagas have a chance to get me excited about playing Tom Bombadil again. But for now, it's just a core deck. It's not expressing anything. It's not too low powered where it's in the vein of my Sam Gamgee deck where it's trying to express something explicitly. It does have some powerful interactions for sure, and Tom can get there just by nature if I get so much value from every single card, because if I have 3 different saga chapters going off every single turn, that value adds up really quickly. So I can't say it's bracket 1. It is in line with a lot of what I would say the typical saga pre-constructed deck would be doing if it was released today. I do want to take a moment at the end of the video to kind of divvy out everything and rank them among how powerful they are at any different bracket level. I want to get through everything first. We'll get everything into the brackets, and then I'll kind of align everything by how powerful and rank them within those brackets as we get everything wrapped up first. So that said, we have my Raggadragga Eldrazi deck, playing specific Eldrazi's that make Eldrazi Scions and Spawns when you enter the battlefield or when you do something, and just a whole bunch of tokens that have the ability to sacrifice it, and you make a colorless mana. And that means that all these Scions and Spawns are going to benefit from Raggadragga's ability to make them more powerful and give them +2/+2 as long as they have a mana ability. So this scales very well. Unfortunately, there aren't a ton of cards that make Eldrazi Scions and Spawns. We did get a pre-constructed deck when Modern Horizons 3 came out that was all about Eldrazi. Gave a little bit of new life, but again, I'm only playing 2 colors, so it's kind of hard for me to say I got a whole lot of boost from there. There's a few cards that I did get in there. Kozilek's Command was definitely one that helped out a lot, but again, one card isn't really going to make or break any given card, push it up a power bracket, I don't think. So with that said, it definitely would probably say it is a bracket 2 deck. It is that core experience because I'm playing a lot of commons and uncommons that just aren't very good anywhere else. But there are still powerful interactions. I'm not saying that it doesn't do powerful things. I do eventually get to 10 mana, or I can cast a big Genesis Wave. There's a couple interactions that I still am discovering about this, whether it's a Kami of Whispered Hopes, where I get to add mana depending on how much power that certain creature has. So Raggadragga has a secondary ability where if I cast a spell that I spent 7 or more mana on, I get to give +7/+7 to a creature and untap it. So if with that Kami Whisper Hopes, that interaction means I get to untap my Kami, give it +7/+7, and then add 7 more mana the next time I tap it for mana. That adds up really quickly, and if you happen to be chaining some Eldrazi together, you get to generate a ton of mana. So there are definitely some powerful spells in the deck, powerful interactions, but overall, I don't know if it would really hang if it tried to scale up. Again, I'm playing a lot of bad commons and uncommons in this deck, so I do think it's comfortably a core. I don't have any game changers in there either. It definitely could be, but there are some powerful cards. A Doubling Season somehow isn't a game changer, which I think there's definitely a very, very good argument for that. So this deck could easily get bumped up to a bracket 3, but for now, I do like it at bracket 2, just because, again, not playing any game changers. It's not going to punch up very well. It can do okay with bracket 3, but it's definitely on par with some of the precon level things. Definitely not the Modern Horizons precons, because those came out with a very explicit goal. This is all about utilizing 0/1s and 1/1s. So for now, I do think that this is a bracket 2. That's at least where the intent of the deck was. On the flip side, we have a deck that definitely had a very different intention, and that is my Koma Cosmos Serpent deck. So this is all about making a whole bunch of different Komas, whether it's with cards like Auton Soldier, or just making a whole bunch of copies of Koma Cosmos Serpent. So my goal is to see how many different coils can I get on the battlefield, how many Komas can I have, and sometimes I take a picture of the board state that this deck is able to create, and it's so wild. We are not sponsored on this channel by Infinitokens, but I could not play this deck without Infinitokens. It's just so much going on. It is so difficult, and this deck it goes really hard. I wanted this to be a powerful deck. It certainly does that. It's not quite optimized yet. And I say yet because I do believe it is a bracket 3 deck. It does a lot of very, very powerful things, but I'm definitely playing some suboptimal card choices in there just because I'm trying to stick to a little bit of a theme. You might notice that with a couple other decks that we talk about as we go through this. So for now, it is upgraded. I do have a couple game changers in there just because I'm playing a 7-drop. I think a Fierce Guardianship is kind of necessary when you're playing something that expensive, and so it was never meant to punch down a little bit. Again, I feel like a lot of these decks that I build in that kind of tipping toe around bracket 3, bracket 4, I would definitely feel okay playing this going up against bracket 4 decks. It might be a little too much for a majority of bracket 2 decks, though. So I know a lot of friends who have some powerful bracket 2 decks, but yeah, this falls kind of in that middle ground. It could be bracket 4. I think some people could make an argument for it, but with the intent of trying to make as many copies as possible, it is bracket 3. It's not playing too many game changers. I am trying to restrain myself a little bit, even though the commander itself does a lot of very, very powerful things. So next up, we're going to talk about another deck that I had very explicit intent with, and that was to stick to a theme of having everything in old border, and that is my Mishra Eminent one. So when this card was first previewed, it was back in Brothers War when they had the pre-constructed decks. Both this and the Urza deck that accommodated it, these were meant to be all in old borders, and I absolutely loved that. I love the aesthetic of these old bordered frames, and so having a deck that came out of the box in that was such a wonderful thing. I was so excited for it. The problem is, when I was sticking to something that was completely in old borders, you really struggle to close out games. You really do struggle to do certain powerful things that are going to win you games, because I was so committed to keeping everything in old border. The card pool in old borders is still pretty small, and it's not explicitly that powerful. There are some powerful interactions, but because it's so stuck to the theme that I'm trying to express here, again, it goes back to expression that is completely bracket 1. This is a bracket 1 deck. The deck takes a lot of game actions. It does a lot of things with Mishra's ability. On every combat, I make a copy of a non-creature artifact. That said, a lot of my non-creature artifacts are not that good, and I'm only making one every turn. There's ways to duplicate that ability, but again, in all old border. It's super, super hard. This deck might be my weakest deck, and I've actually struggled with this identity for a while. It is old border, but being able to accomplish anything meaningful is super hard to do. I don't think I've ever won a game with this deck, and really it's just, again, it's in this identity crisis space where I'm not really sure what I want to do with it. I might be just retiring this deck sometime soon because it doesn't really bring me that much joy. It doesn't do anything meaningful. And even with my Samwise Gamgee deck, it still feels like I'm doing something meaningful with my game actions. I feel like I'm doing something that's going to eventually express something that I'm trying to do, and my Mishra Eminent 1 deck just doesn't do that anymore. This is definitely a candidate to get cut, especially with how many decks I plan on building with the upcoming Final Fantasy set. It might get a little out of hand then. So for now, Mishra Eminent 1 does exist, but it definitely is on life support when it comes to if I'm going to keep it or not. Speaking of identity crisis, next up is another deck that I've kind of have in a similar space, which is my Faldorn Dreadwolf Herald deck. So this deck is all about casting things from exile and then getting some sort of benefit, whether it's making wolves with my commander, whether it's copying them with now Feshni and cards like that. There's a lot of game actions too that can happen, and sometimes the board does get a little complicated, but again, converting those meaningful things into wins is really, really hard. This is actually a weird case because the pre-constructed deck out of the box had a game changer in it. It had a Jessica's Will, which means it should have been bracket 3, but I did downgrade that because I wanted this to be pretty strongly in bracket 2, that core majority of precons as it's going. And this deck was pretty powerful out of the box. I know a lot of people said this might have been one of the more powerful pre-constructed decks originally. And so I've tried to keep it in line with that. It still is a core bracket 2 deck, but this also is kind of a weird spot because I don't really know what I'm trying to do with it quite yet, other than just casting things from exile. And I need a little more purpose from a deck than just, well, I'm just doing the thing that the commander explicitly says. I need to find some little more enjoyment from that. So for now, it's going in brackets 2. I don't know if I'm going to keep this deck because, again, there's a lot of really cool sets that are coming up that I might need to cut some decks for to make room. And there's definitely, the next deck is one that I am not going to be cutting to make room, and that is my Ardenn and Kediss deck. So this is my Voltron deck, and folks that know me that have listened to the podcast for a long time, I had a Valduk Keeper of the Flame deck for a long, long time. I did retire that deck. I just happened to find myself not really playing it a whole lot because it only did one thing, that was go aggressive, and it drew so much hate that often I would end up dying just because I would flip over a Valduk and people would say, well, you're going to kill us quick, so that means we got to kill you quick. And that deck does not play defense at all. So what I ended up doing was turning it into my Ardenn and Kediss deck. I actually opened both of these commanders in the same pack, and I took that as a little bit of a sign that this might be a good chance for me to shift a little bit, get away from Valduk being kind of a one-trick pony into something a little more diverse, able to handle situations way better than my Valduk deck did, especially on the defensive side of things. And so this definitely took over, and I kind of pillaged a lot of cards from my Valduk deck in order to make room for Ardenn and Kediss. And this deck, holy cow, reinvigorated that archetype for me, the putting all sorts of equipment onto one thing, a big old Voltron type of deck, and got me very excited to play it all over again. Being able to turn everything sideways and deal a ton of damage to the entire table all at once. This deck is definitely optimized. I play a lot of tutors in it. I play some game changers. I would love to get an Ancient Tomb. I currently only have 3 game changers, but if I can get a couple more, I would love to keep pushing this into the further optimized level. This deck goes hard. It punches very, very well. There's a lot of play to it too. There's some fun interactions that I kind of have discovering as I've played this deck more and more. It's a lot of fun and definitely is bracket 4. I don't know if it's quite fast enough to keep up with EDH. I don't know if any of my decks really are on that aspect, but definitely I could not play this in good faith against a bracket 2 deck and feel good about it. That's with all 3 of these so far. If I played against a bracket 2, it would feel a little bit like cheating, and I don't want anybody to feel cheated in these games of Commander. Next up is my Sygg River Guide deck. So this, another themed deck, very explicitly has an intent going into it, and this is my pre-DH deck. So these are all cards printed from before Scars of Mirrodin. So there is a very specific time limit, and I don't know if you know this or not, but cards have gotten way more powerful since Scars of Mirrodin. The power creep has just gotten out of hand, and so I really like this as a time capsule to look back on when I grew up playing and all the cards that are familiar to me and getting a chance to play them again. That doesn't mean it doesn't do some cool things. There aren't some powerful interactions. There's a tutor, I believe, but because it only tutors up for merfolk. It's such a small card pool, especially compared to what decks are doing these days. I can't call this anything other than bracket 1. This is purely expressing what Commander was like over 15 years ago. And I love this deck so much because I played Merfolk in Modern and Legacy for a long time. So I get a chance to play some of those old reliable cards that I've cast so many times in other formats and still get a chance to enjoy them in Commander. But again, this does not punch up at all. There's maybe like 3 spells that you would put in a typical deck in 2025. So definitely cannot put this any higher than bracket 1 because it had a very specific intent and it's doing a great job of that. Next up, we have my Ukkima and Cazur deck. So this is my Sultai deck that also kind of went through a little bit of an evolution, especially in the command zone. I've always enjoyed +1/+1 counters, just a way to beef up your creatures. And so years and years ago when I first built this deck, I played this actually as a Muldrotha the Gravetide deck, just being able to loop things like Implement of Ferocity, real powerhouse type of cards back then. They never were, and they still aren't, but it was really fun to get to play a commander that supported +1/+1 counters on some level at least with Ukkima and Cazur. So Ukkima is that unblockable commander that I just love suiting up with all of those +1/+1 counters, being able to protect it in some way, and then having it leave the battlefield ability. This one actually was probably a little bit more powerful. I did have a couple game changers in this deck when the bracket system was rolled out, and I found myself wanting to pillage that a little bit. I wanted to put it down a bracket. It probably could punch up a little bit to play with bracket 3, but I don't think it is fast enough anymore to party with the bracket 4 decks. It's definitely not optimized. It's committed to the theme, so it is probably bracket 2 at this point. There's, again, no game changers anymore. I did pull those out after the system was released, and people might look at this deck and say, well, you have a really expensive mana base. That's just because I happened to play Sultai colors when I was playing Legacy, so I have the duels. I have the Bayou. I have all those original duels, but as the Commander announcement mentioned when they were releasing brackets, it specifically stated that the land base isn't really indicative of power level anymore because it's so easy to have so many quality rare dual lands, and then there's triumphs. There's all sorts of ways to build a quality mana base and you don't have to break the bank. So these dual lands, they're super luxury items. They're just kind of there for show at this point, but the rest of the deck is still committing yourself to that core experience. And so it definitely, this would be a brackets 2 deck. It doesn't punch up, but it also isn't doing anything too dominating. It can do some powerful things. It can be a little hard to deal with Ukkima if the deck really gets out of hand. But I think that's a lot of brackets 2 decks. I definitely think that my Ukkima and Cazur deck is definitely that core brackets 2 type of experience there. So next up we have my Kyler Sigardian Emissary deck. And so again, it's another Selesnya deck. I love playing Selesnya colors. They do this all the types of fun things that I enjoy doing in a commander game. This one is all about playing a whole bunch of humans, making Kyler into a really, really powerful anthem, and then just overrunning the entire board. It's a really fun deck. There's a couple game changers in there. I just really haven't found myself reaching for this deck very often lately. It kind of had the same play patterns over and over and over again, and it wasn't doing anything distinct. And that's one thing that I do want from a lot of my decks, is to have the ability to do something distinct from game to game. I don't want everything to play out the exact same way. And I found myself with this Kyler deck, it really did repeat itself quite a bit. I also have a deck at similar power level in the exact same colors. The theme is a little bit differently, but there's just so much overlap between my Emiel the Blessed deck and my Kyler Sigardian Emissary deck. It's really, really hard for me to differentiate between those. So I found myself not really coming back to my Kyler deck very often. This deck also is one of those that's kind of on life support because it's a bracket 3 deck. It has a couple game changers, but it also is doing kind of similar things to what I'm doing in a couple other decks in the exact same colors. Really hard for me to keep coming back to this deck. So this might be a deck that gets culled eventually, but for now, it is still in existence. It is a bracket 3 deck. It's upgraded. It did come as a precon originally, but again, it got upgraded. I optimized a few of the cards, not completely, but I did add some game changers. I added some cards to increase the synergy. So it definitely is, by definition, an upgraded precon with some better card choices in there. So next up is another deck that I've had for quite a while, but also I just find myself not really sure what the identity of it is anymore. It's gone through a couple iterations, but in the current form, it's just trying to sneak in some really big beefy beaters, and that is my Vaevictis Asmadi, the Dire deck. It's all about having something on the battlefield and chaos warping something for every single player. And it's a lot of fun. It does some very powerful things, but sometimes it just doesn't quite get there. It is a little slow. This is a bracket 3 deck. It does have one game changer in there, which is Survival of the Fittest, as a way to discard creatures I don't really need and getting big beefy beaters into my hand where I can cheat them into play with some really fun cards like Last March of the Ents, one of my favorite cards. This deck definitely is kind of a pet card central, where it's what cards can I not play in any other format that I really want to enjoy. There's cards that are going to double damage. There's just just a bunch of 8 and 9 drops, which eventually you get to casting 8 and 9 drops every single turn, you're going to win games. So it definitely wouldn't really be bracket 1 just playing big dumb things. I definitely think that it's fallen right into that bracket 3 space just because there's only one game changer. I don't play any tutors in it anymore. It's definitely been powered down a little bit. It probably could have been competing to be in the near bracket 4 if it had better ramp packages in there. But as is, it's got too many pet cards to go into bracket 4. And it may not be a little too fun for most bracket 1 decks. I am still trying to express something, but like I said, there's just powerful cards in the deck. It's really hard to keep cranking out these big, powerful effects without eventually just taking over the game that I think bracket 1 wouldn't really be enjoying. Bracket 2 for sure. So this is kind of on the cusp of brackets 2 and 3. It probably is one of my weaker bracket 3 decks just because there's only one game changer. It doesn't really make all that big of a difference, but again, by letter of the law, it is bracket 3. Next up, we're going to talk about my Shanid Sleeper's Scourge deck. And this deck actually, since the rollout of the commander brackets, went through the most changes, but also maybe benefited the most from the brackets being announced. This deck did get announced and come in a pre-constructed deck, and I made some changes to it, but I think the best way to describe how I changed the deck is updates, not upgrades. There's a whole lot of suboptimal cards in there. There was one game changer in there, and this definitely is not a bracket 3 deck. None of the cards I think really could be considered upgraded from what you would expect at the typical pre-constructed level these days. The precon is a few years old too. It came out in Dominaria United, and that happened a while ago at this point. So it's really hard for me to say this is an upgraded deck because if anything, their lateral moves that I've been doing, I've been updating the deck, but I definitely have not been upgrading the deck. There's no game changers in here either, and not really any tutors. So it's really hard for me to say that this has been upgraded beyond brackets 2 at the core experience for most players. So I'm really excited to see what happens with this deck in the coming months. It does struggle a little bit to turn the corner, and so it really is hard for me to say this is going to punch up 2 bracket 4 decks. It will kind of struggle sometimes with upgraded decks even, so safely in brackets 2 for my Shanid Sleeper's Scourge deck. But another deck that doesn't struggle to punch up is my Ovika Enigma Goliath deck. Very strongly in the bracket 3 upgraded space. This deck is a lot of fun, but also it kind of, again, fell into the same patterns that some of my other decks did, where it kind of repeated itself a lot. It had the same play patterns where I kind of sat back a little bit, let the game develop, and then I would come in later on and then finally kind of sweep in and do the killing blows all around. So it does do a really good job at making a whole lot of tokens. Those tokens having haste that Ovika makes really is a world of difference from any other token generator in this Spellslinger archetype. But I absolutely love it. I get to play some super powerful and splashy spells that I don't get to play anywhere else. Like Surge to Victory is one of my favorite spells in this deck. Getting to make 6 tokens that are suddenly going to get the battlefield and then see Surge to Victory resolve, get a huge buff, and then swing in and start casting even more spells. It's super fun. It's super powerful. It definitely doesn't have all optimized card choices in there. There's some that I think I should be cutting for some better and more efficient versions of that effect, but it does have the potential to do some powerful things. So it is not quite optimized. I can't put it in bracket 4, and I have definitely been run over by some brackets 2 or what would be brackets 2 now decks. So this one for now is bracket 3. There's a couple game changers because you're playing a 7 mana commander. You probably want Fierce Guardianship to be able to protect your commander that you invest so much mana in, because once you get to 9 mana for your commander, that's basically infinite mana. There are some suboptimal cards that keep it from being considered what I would say the optimized category, but it is a good, strong bracket 3 deck. And next up, we have a card. Again, it's kind of like my Shanid Sleeper's Scourge deck, my Aragorn One True King deck. This deck was definitely updated, but it wasn't upgraded. And so what I mean by that is I put in some more optimal card choices from Lord of the Rings and put in a bunch of characters that I really enjoy from Lord of the Rings. But this is, it's a better version of my Sam Gamgee deck. I'm still trying to express something pretty explicit with what I did in the deck, but it's definitely not upgraded. It's definitely not hanging with decks that are a little more powerful than where the precon was. Kind of a lateral move, kind of like what I did with Shanid Sleeper's Scourge. It's brackets 2. It can do some cool things. It can do some powerful things, but it's definitely not doing it consistently, and I'm not optimized into doing it quickly. And so definitely it still is that brackets 2 deck for me. And then finally, my Legolas deck. This one is actually very hard for me to seed correctly. It was a really fun deck. There are no game changers, but it is certainly powerful, doing things pretty consistently and pretty powerfully. So it's in that no game changer bracket 3 space where I wouldn't be surprised if I could play this with bracket 4, but I also don't think it would be very good necessarily, because it's kind of doing one thing and it's super reliant on my commander being in play. That's what the whole deck kind of boils down to, is putting a whole bunch of +1/+1 counters onto Legolas. So I would love to get to play this deck in the new bracket system. I don't think it would do very well against bracket 4 decks because it is pretty reliant on having my commander in play, but it is able to do some powerful things. For now, I have it in brackets 2. That's what the intent was, because again, I'm trying to do a little bit more expression in a lot of these decks. It can win games, but it doesn't necessarily try to every single game. So it's in that weird bracket 2, bracket 3 space. I'm going to put it in bracket 3 just to keep that bell curve going. But again, if I played it a little bit more, I would feel totally fine putting it down to bracket 2 and calling it a good bracket 2 level deck. So this one very much could be, everybody can look at the deck list that I have over on Architect, and you're going to tell me this is definitely brackets 2. This isn't playing at bracket 3. And I would probably say you're right. But for now, I do think it should be in bracket 3 because it can do some pretty powerful things if things go right. But that also describes a lot of decks that are playing Commander. So with that said, that is all of my decks put into brackets for now. So what are the rankings within any given bracket, and how do they kind of play out against each other? So we'll start with bracket 1 here and how powerful these decks are against each other. I would definitely say that my Sygg River Guide is the most powerful. Eventually just going to turn everything into islands, and I have a whole lot of island walk in that deck because Lord of Atlantis gives all my merfolk island walk. That means they're unblockable. That means I'm dealing a lot of damage to your face. So it definitely can win games. But again, the narrow card pool keeps it from getting too out of hand. I'm still trying to express something which is just a time capsule of a deck. So with that said, it is a really good bracket 1 deck, but it definitely is not a bracket 2 or anywhere close to that. Next up, I would say that my Salmon Frodo deck is there as my second most powerful, and then Mishra Eminent 1. That's probably the most accurate way. Mishra Eminent 1 is my weakest deck. It takes a lot of game actions, but very rarely does it actually do anything meaningful, and that's a problem. That means you're not winning very many games. You're not doing anything powerful. When it comes to my core bracket 2 decks, definitely Council 4 is my most powerful bracket 2 deck, but it's meant to be. It's meant to punch up. If I wanted to add a couple cards in there and have it play with bracket 4, it totally could. That's just the way that the deck was intended to be. So it could also just be just as good as my Sygg River Guide deck, just because the deck's been designed to scale up or down. After that, I would probably say that my Raggadragga deck is my second most powerful. So I'm going to scoot over there. It does some really, really cool things. Like I mentioned, it's going to make a whole bunch of mana. It's going to cast a whole bunch of big spells, but the consistency isn't there. And again, it's relying on some really bad cards, trying to make them work really well. So it is a good brackets 2 deck, but it still is definitely a brackets 2 deck. From there, I would definitely say my Ukkima and Cazur deck is my next most powerful brackets 2 deck. It's got some consistency to it. It does some very, very powerful things, but again, it's still committed to a pretty strong theme. It is a supported theme for sure, but I try to stick to it pretty well there. After that, I would probably say Shanid Sleeper's Scourge, just because there's a lot of potential for some powerful things there. It does draw a lot of cards, but again, it struggles to convert that card advantage into actually winning games. From there, Faldorn definitely is the most powerful next to that. It's capable for sure. I just haven't had a chance to see it, and so this one I'm kind of leaning on all of the reviews of that deck in order to project where this would be. And then probably Tom Bombadil and my Aragorn decks from there. They're kind of a little too committed to the theme a little bit. They maybe play down a space, but they're still solidly in brackets 2 because they're not going to hang on anything with bracket 4 there. Into my bracket 3 decks, this one is actually really, really complicated, really hard to do. I probably would say Koma Cosmos Serpent is my most powerful bracket 3 deck. Just because it's Koma. It does some powerful things. The commander is absolutely busted. Again, some of the suboptimal card choices that I play in this specific deck keep it from being what I would say is the optimized bracket 4 experience, but it still is super powerful. If my commander gets to hang out for a turn or two, I'm getting a ton of advantage. So make sure to destroy those Komas as soon as you see them, folks, because this deck gets out of hand quickly. After that, I would definitely say Emiel the Blessed. This actually order looks kind of straightforward for me. I like this order for the rest of these decks. Emiel, then Kyler. They're kind of, like I said, they're kind of doing the same thing in the same color combination. it's just similar power level. So if I took Kyler apart, I probably wouldn't miss it because I have my Emiel the Blessed, and it's just kind of carrying what I like to do in those Selesnya colors. Then my Vaevictis Asmadi, the Dire deck, it's just doing big, powerful things, but it's doing them very slowly. It's a super slow deck. Same as my Ovika Enigma Goliath deck. It's capable. There's definitely a lot of potential to do powerful things, but a lot of the card choices are not optimal at all. And so that kind of holds the decks back from really being able to hang consistently with bracket 4 decks. And then my weakest definitely would be my Legolas deck, because like I said, it's on that cusp of being brackets 2. By definition, it is a brackets 2 deck, but it is capable of doing some powerful things. So for the sake of being safe with the estimation on Legolas, it is in bracket 3. And finally, we get to the optimized bracket 4 decks. And looking at the order there, this probably looks right. I think this is a pretty safe way to say that Jetmir might be my most powerful deck that I own right now. It is super, super powerful. It's capable of some really fast starts. And I've told people coming out the gate, like, this deck is trying to win. It's trying to be quick about it too. So I think Jetmir Nexus of Revels, my Heir Apparent deck, that is my most powerful deck at the moment. Omnath Locus of Rage from there. Yeah, that deck is tuned. I've had it for forever. I know exactly what I'm trying to do with it at any given stage in the game. And with that, just the knowledge of that deck means it's probably my second most powerful. And finally, my Ardenn and Kediss deck coming in as my third most powerful bracket 4 deck. It does some really, really cool things. It cheats a lot of mana costs, and it just goes sideways really quickly. I really like this deck. It's super powerful. So yeah, so I would say it is definitely my third most powerful bracket 4 deck in my offerings. Now, a lot of you might be asking, Matt, why don't you have any CDH? You mentioned a lot of the tournaments that you used to play in. You used to be a grinder. Why don't you have any CDH decks? And I've always been curious. I'm interested in what I would like to play in CDH. And I've had some friends give me a few options. So I'm always kind of curious about tiptoeing into the CDH space. I do play a fair amount of Brawl whenever I'm playing Arena, just to kind of get my daily quests out of the way. And I have a Rusko the Clockmaker deck that I would love to see if that translates. Now, I know one thing about CEDH is they're playing to the letter of the law. Whatever the rules are of the game, whatever the ban list is, whatever the current rule structure, as it may flux a little bit is, they're going to play to it. And Rusko is not a legal commander, technically. It is a arena-only card that they happen to print in mystery boosters. And so I would be curious if the CEDH community let me play Rusko, even though it's not technically, it's kind of like an uncard. It's not technically a legal commander that I could pick from. So it is kind of curious. I would like to see what happens there if I could play Rusko. But I've also had some friends say, Matt, if you had a Valduk deck, Slicer Hired Muscle is absolutely the commander for you. It's mono red, it turns things sideways, it's playing a lot of equipment, doing a little bit of disruption with stuff like Blood Moon. I think that also sounds kind of like what I would like to do. But I've also heard that mono red is kind of in a weird space right now. You lost a lot of the things that made mono red so reliably good. You don't have Dockside Extortionist anymore. You don't have Mana Crypt for your fast mana. But I also have heard other things too, that CDH is actually fine and great. So maybe mono red lacks a little bit compared to what it used to. And I still have a couple other options that I would like to look at when it comes to CDH. But as it is right now, I don't have any CDH decks. I still am in that I'm curious, but I haven't committed quite yet to CEDH. But with that all said, that's all my decks. That's my rankings when it comes to where do I put them in the brackets and how do I value them with their power level. We would love to hear from you. So make sure to like this video, subscribe on YouTube, leave a comment on what you think about the brackets. Do my decks fall into the where you would put them, or is there a little bit of discrepancy there? So give them a peek and let us know what you think. Did I bracket them correctly, or do I kind of give everything a little bit too much credit? Should Legolas actually be a brackets 2 deck? Or on the same vein, should Raggadragga with its big powerful Eldrazi be actually up in bracket 3? Let us know in the comment section below, because I definitely want to hear what you think about how I bracketed my decks. With that, we're going to sign off for today. So as always, make sure EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.